Palm Sunday, and it means that we're getting ready to wrap up the season of Lent. It also means that we're coming to the conclusion of this series we've been in called In the Meantime, where we've been exploring this idea that for many of us, there are different seasons in our life that feel like we're just in a waiting phase, where we're praying for God to do what only He can do, that He would show up and bring restoration to relationships, that He would bring our adult children back into a relationship with Him, that He would give us guidance and direction for the future. And kind of the big point we've tried to underscore week in and week out is that God is still working even in the seasons of our waiting. But I wanted to end this series by talking about one of the things that can frustrate us when we're waiting is that sometimes it seems like God starts to answer our prayers, but He doesn't do it completely. It's like, we think He's starting to move, but then things still feel like they're the same. It's like this spiritual whiplash. We probably all experienced this to some degree or another. I remember several years ago, my wife, through her company, won a trip to a private island. So there were 10 people who won this, and so there's just a handful of us who are going. And when I say, it is less than a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I mean, we flew in on a seaplane. They took us to do all these crazy excursions. Like, we went to Iguana Island, which seems like something out of Jurassic Park, and there we were swimming with pigs. We had lunch on a sand spit, which is that's what they do on Survivor. You can understand why I love this so much. Like, a sand spit is an island that only appears at low tide and disappears at high tide. But one of my favorite parts of it was on this island, they had this 9-hole par 3 course all around the outside edges. Now, I don't play golf. I am not good at golf. It is fine. But I was like, you know what? We're going to soak in all the experiences. Well, the golf pro they had there on site was a guy who actually won the PGA championship. That's like one of the 4 major tournaments. So he's just sitting there in a chair, and you walk up and say, I would like to play golf. And he says, hop in the golf cart. And he takes you, and it's like teaching you. So I remember I'm hitting most of mine into the ocean, but we're having a good time. And we get to the 4th hole, and I just look around, and I'm like, you got the ocean here, the once-in-a-lifetime kind of experience. And I'm like, is this real life? Because this doesn't happen to people like maybe celebrities or really rich people, but I'm a pastor. I don't get these types of experience. And in that moment, I'm like, could we just pause and live this day forever? You ever have those moments in your life? I just want this day to last forever. And then, of course, a few days later, we flew back home to a house with a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 10-year-old. We're fighting with them to eat their chicken nuggets. We're refereeing disagreements between them and counting down the moments till bedtime. So you go from I want this day to last forever to now, man, it feels like this day is lasting forever. It's like a whiplash kind of experience. And there are times where it seems like God's working in your marriage and things are getting better, only to find yourself having those same arguments again and again and again. Feels like you see God working in the lives of your kids and they're taking positive steps only to see them backslide time and time again. What do we do when it feels like God has answered prayers in part, but there's still more that we're waiting for? That's where I want us to start this morning. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and open to Psalm 126. We're going to read the entire psalm. But as you're turning there, I just kind of want to set the context for what we're about to read. The Psalms is a book of different worship songs that were rooted in ancient Israel. And this particular song is part of a subset called Songs of Ascent. These would have actually been sung every year during different festivals when Jewish people from all over the world would travel back to Jerusalem to celebrate. As they would walk into the town, they would sing these songs of ascent. And this one was written at a particularly crucial moment in Israel's history. If you've been tracking with us through this series, you know that in the Old Testament, it tells the story of the nation of Israel. They were commanded to be a people who were separate, who were different from the rest of the world. Not that they were perfect and got everything right, but they were supposed to show the world this is what it looks like to be in relationship with God, and this is what it looks like to live the life He intends for us to live. The language we use here at Bridgepoint is they were supposed to embody heaven on earth. But of course, they made the same choice that many of us make. We don't want to be different from the rest of the world. We kind of want to be like everybody else. And so instead of being faithful to God, they worship other deities. Instead of living for Him, they decide to live for themselves. And as a result, God says, I'm not going to force this relationship on you. he removes his protection, and Israel's enemies come in and conquer them. In particular, we've been exploring this period where the Babylonians came in, and they destroyed the temple. Now, this is a huge cataclysmic event in the history of the nation of Israel, because the temple wasn't just a building where you went to sing some worship songs and attend a service. This is where the Spirit of God lived. So when the temple was destroyed in a very tangible way, it felt like God had left the building. Not only that, but the Babylonians shipped the Jewish people off to other parts of the empire, and so they find themselves living in a foreign land ruled by a foreign people, and it feels like God had abandoned them. Now, talk about people who know what a season of waiting feels like. And I don't know about you, sometimes I'm like, man, I hope my season of waiting only lasts a few months, maybe the longest a couple years. For the Jewish people, they spent 70 years living in the Babylonian exile. Now, I'm sure that they were praying and begging God every day, let us go back to Jerusalem. Please restore your people back to the way things used to be. And after 70 years, the Persians conquer the Babylonians. They have a different approach to foreign policy. They allow the Jewish people to return back to Jerusalem. So imagine the feelings that must have been going through their hearts and their minds as they were returning back home after 70 years away. There's this excitement, this anticipation, they just cannot wait to see what God is going to do, only to arrive in Jerusalem and discover the city is still lying in ruins. Now, they start to rebuild the temple, only to quickly realize this one will pale in comparison to Solomon's temple. They had been excited, but now they're discouraged. God had answered part of their prayers for restoration, but there was still more work to be done. Are we tracking so far? That is the context in which Psalm 126 was written. So I want to read the whole thing this morning, starting in verse 1. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Our mouths were filled with laughter then, and our tongues with shouts of joy. Then they said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord had done great things for us. We were joyful. Restore our fortunes, Lord, like water courses in the Negev. Those who sow in tears will reap with shouts of joy. Though one goes along weeping, carrying the bag of seed, he will surely come back with shouts of joy, carrying his sheaves. It's a short psalm, maybe even a confusing psalm, but there is so much packed in these few verses. It's really split into two halves. The first half says, God, you've restored us. You've done great things. We're full of joy and laughter. But then there's a turn halfway through that says, but restore us, God. We're sowing with tears, and we want to reap with happiness. We're going out sad, but we want to return with joy. You can start to notice the tone. Yes, God, you've done some work, but there's still more work to be done. What do we do when we find ourselves in this situation? There's a few truths that are jumping right off the page to us as we read through this psalm. The first one is this. When we think about the work that God's doing in our life, we have to remember that God's work is real. Like, God has been faithful. They were back in Jerusalem. The city's in ruins. The temple's not what they hoped it would be, but God was still working. God had still restored them. And I think it's so important for us to grasp this because we live in a culture where we're constantly focusing on the negative, on the bad things. I don't know if you're ever like me. You're like scrolling your phone. You're like, I have to put this up because I don't think the human brain was designed to carry this much weight of what's going on in the world. And in fact, oftentimes what we're tempted to do is focus more on the gap than on the gain. Here's what I mean. Maybe you're like thinking, okay, I'm trying to save up for some big expense. And so you're tucking away, $10 here and $50 there and $100 there. And you've been at it for years now. And sometimes you look at your bank account and you're like, man, I'm still so far from my goal. We're looking at the gap between where we are and where we want to be. But what we need to do is shift it to look, what is the gain? Where did I start and where am I now? Because when we start to look at the gain instead of the gap, we remember that God is faithful. He is with us and he is still working. My life and the ministry here at Bridgepoint are like intertwined together in ways that God's faithfulness to Bridgepoint is his faithfulness to me. I've shared stories over the years, and so I'm not going to list them all out. But, when I started here at Bridgepoint, our church was $26,000 in debt and bringing in $28,000 a month. We were behind on payroll and on bills. It was, in ministry, we call that a bad situation to be in. And so coming in, we had to make some changes, and we had to kind of position ourselves correctly. And because of God's faithfulness, within 6 months, we were out of debt and continue to operate debt-free to this day. Now, that's a story I keep coming back to because there have been moments since then where we were in a building that financially we weren't going to be able to sustain any more rent increases, and I could see this coming a year in advance. I spent a whole year stressed and worrying about what are we going to do, when in reality we weren't going to do anything. It had to be God's faithfulness in the life of our church. And so I remember, if he was faithful then, he can be faithful now, and he was. He moved us right in this prime location in downtown Woodstock with rent that is way under market value. He's been so good to us. And we should all be taking time every day to look back and remember that the work that God has done in our life is not imagined. It isn't in the past. It is real, and he continues to work in our lives today. But the second thing I see in this passage is not only is God's work real, God's work is also incomplete. Now, I want to clarify this because I don't want someone to screenshot this on YouTube. I am not talking about the work that Jesus accomplished on the cross. That is complete, done, it is finished. What I mean is the work he is doing in our lives, he still has more to do. I find that every time God is working and growing me in some area, it's like another thing starts to pop up, right? Like maybe he's working on my pride, and I look back and say, wow, God has really made me humble. I am the most humble person I know. Sorry, there's pride right again, rearing its ugly head. There's always this work. In fact, in Scripture, it says that when we follow Jesus, we are a new creation. But there are times where we follow Jesus and he instantly takes away an addiction. He instantly heals us from some disease. But that's not the normal pattern and mode of operation of God. Normally, it's this steady work that he's doing over the years to shape us and change us, to renovate us into this new creation. When my wife and I first got married, I went on this kick where I loved watching. I don't know, you remember the old shows where they take normal people are trying to flip a house for the first time? And this is pre-2008 housing crash. And so these people who have never picked up a hammer a day in their life put zero money down on a house. And they're like, we can flip this thing in under 30 days and I won't have to make the mortgage payment. And it's these episodes, it's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. You know exactly how it's going to pan out. They're going to demo and they think, man, this is great. And then every time they try to do something, they uncover a problem that's got to be fixed. They're coming out of pocket for all these expenses. And so every single time they end up moving into the house because they can't afford their rent and the mortgage is due on this property. And so you start to get this really funny scene where they will fix up the master bathroom and it will look pristine, like something out of a magazine, and the camera pans over to their air mattress in the master bedroom that's been stripped down to the studs. Or the kitchen looks immaculate, and then you look over, and the living room lies in ruins. By the way, this is what it looks like when God begins renovating our lives. There are rooms that he comes in, and he is working, and he's shaping. He's tearing some things down to the studs so he can build up something new. And there are parts of our lives that look a lot more like new creation than other parts. And we have to reckon with the fact that God is going to continue the work, but there will be seasons where it feels like certain rooms in our lives are sitting incomplete. That's part of the human experience. Not only that, but also God's work comes through suffering. It's something we don't always love to talk about, right? Certainly renovations come with their own fair share of suffering. But I love the image they use here in the psalm. It says, those who sow with tears reap with joy. I've shared over the years my misadventures in gardening. I have a love-hate relationship with gardening. I love to try, and my garden hates me. So I can never get anything to grow. But my friend Erin, she's fantastic. In fact, yesterday she was talking me off the ledge because I'm like, my hydrangeas I planted 3 years ago are the same size they were when I planted them. And she had to tell me, this is normal. It's going to be okay. But a couple of months ago, we were over at their house, and she had these cookie sheets full of what looked like brownies. And she had to tell us, these are not brownies, that is soil. And inside the soil, there are seeds. Now, you put the seeds, I don't know if you've ever grown anything from seed. You water for it, you care for it, and what happens the next day? Nothing. And the next day, nothing. Finally, after weeks, you get a little green thing starts to poke through. And we were hanging out the other day. She has I swear there's probably 50 to 75 tomato plants. I'm like, what are you going to do with all these? She's like, I'm just going to have to give some away. But here's the crazy thing, all right? Because Erin's so good at this, she's going to plant these in her garden, and she will have a tomato that's as big as this table right here. And she will eat it, and it will be awesome, and we will all be in awe of her harvest, but we will forget that there was a lot of sowing and waiting in the meantime. Now, in this psalm, they're talking about people, the Jewish people, it was an agrarian culture. So when we garden here and we get fruit, we know, right? If you put in the time cost, it is more expensive to grow your own vegetables than it is just to go and pay 50 cents for a jalapeno at the store. Okay, that's cheaper to do that. We do it because it's fun. But for these people who are writing and singing this psalm, they did this because this is how they survived. They planted because they only got to eat what they harvested. And so think about what they're going through. The most valuable thing they can have is a seed. And they take that seed and they bury it into the ground. And at some level, they have to wait for that seed to die so that new life can grow. And the hope is that it will eventually multiply. But this is what happens in our own lives. In these seasons of waiting, sometimes it's costly for us. We have to take things that we've been holding on to and be willing to surrender them to God. We have to be willing to let them die so God can grow something new. Sometimes when we're in those seasons where it feels like he's not working and he's not moving, there is work that's happening. We just can't see it yet. And what God does, he does his best work in seasons that are uncertain, seasons that are confusing, seasons that are often full of pain. In fact, I have found in my own life that God does some of his best work when things are growing under the surface in seasons that we never would have chosen for ourselves. But we're reminded here that those who sow through the tears one day will reap in joy. Which brings me to the last thing I see here in this passage. So not only is God's work real and complete, not only does it come through suffering, but God's work will be finished. The psalmist says, we know that there will be someone who goes out sad. They will come back full of joy. What is put in the ground and dies does come back to life again. God's work isn't done. Sometimes I love that phrase, don't put a period where God has put a comma. We think this season of life that we're in is all there's ever going to be. And I totally understand this impulse, because have you ever been through a season where it felt like your relationship with God felt dry? Where it felt like you're wandering in the wilderness? Dare I say it may even have felt dead? One of the illustrations I've loved to use over the years is of Death Valley in California. I think we have a picture of Death Valley here. It is the hottest place in the world, which is wild to think about, right? This is not halfway around. This is California, United States. In the summertime, the average highs are in the 120s. The average lows at night are in the 90s. This sounds awful to me. The highest temperature ever recorded was here in Death Valley at 134 degrees. Nothing grows here. That's why they call it Death Valley. You see how dry the land is? But something happens is every so often a storm will blow through. And when the storm dumps all this rain, the ground is so dry it actually can't even absorb it. So this whole thing turns into a lake. I think we have a picture of some people boating on the lake. So this is Death Valley again. And it will sit like this for some time until eventually the water works its way into the ground. Now, a few weeks later, we get something that scientists call a super bloom. And that's when Death Valley turns from an arid place into a place teeming with life. Mr. Joel, we got that super bloom picture. This is the same place that was dead weeks earlier, is now full of life. And what it reminds us is Death Valley was never dead. The seeds of potential for life were hidden under the surface. They just had to wait for the right environment. Could those seeds force the rain to come? No. But they could be in the right position so that when the rain came, life could bloom. And in the same way, we can't force God to move. I wish we could. But God is not a cosmic vending machine where we put a few good deeds in and get something good out. I told you before, when I'm a huge Ohio State fan, and when I was a kid, I thought if I'm just really good this week and I don't say any bad words and I don't pick a fight with my sister, then the Buckeyes are going to win. And trust me, if that was true, we would have won a lot more national championships by now. I'll do anything to help my team win. That's how we approach God sometimes. If we just do the right things, will you do what we want you to do? That's not how it works. But we can position ourselves so when he's ready to move, we're ready to receive it. So how do we position ourselves in these seasons of waiting? The first thing I think we need to do is we need to remember. We need to remember the seasons of God's faithfulness in our life. You know, memory's a funny thing. I was reading an article recently about what neurologists and psychologists are talking about the way that we access our memories. See, we kind of think we just go in the archives, pull out the file, we relive the memory, and then we store it away. But actually what they're learning is every time you access a memory, you change it slightly, and it's the slightly changed memory that gets stored again to be recalled later. And I know this sounds like a weird thing, but this makes sense. Because have you ever been talking to your siblings and you're recalling a story from your childhood and you're like, that's not how that happened at all? Or your kids tell a story of something that happened when they were younger and you're like, that's not even true. Or you ever been talking to somebody who just told themselves a lie enough they convinced themselves that the lie was true? That's because that's how our brains work. Now, we can actually use this in our favor because when we look at God's faithfulness in our past, what we do is we reinforce that belief into our looking forward. We train ourselves to look for God's faithfulness in the future because we've seen it all along in the past. Another way we could say this is what you rehearse, you reinforce. By the way, that's why I hate golf so much. Because you can give me a bucket of 500 golf balls, I can go to the driving range, I won't get any better. I will just reinforce all the bad habits that I already have. I need someone who can sit down with me and teach me how to actually swing a golf club. And in the same way, what we do when we go back to the past, you ever met those people and they're like, well, this person did this to me and this boss was me and there's always somebody else's fault. They've trained themselves to be the victim. They've trained themselves to always see everyone else as a problem. But if we're willing to look back and remember God's faithfulness, we train ourselves to have hope in every situation. We need to remember. The second thing we need to do is we need to trust. And by the way, this trust, I know this word, we toss it around and it seems really vague, but I want to be clear. When I talk about trusting God in a season of waiting, I'm not talking about a feeling. I'm talking about a commitment to a set of choices and decisions that we will make. Here's what trust looks like. You ready? There's 3 things we could do to trust. The first one is just name the areas that feel unfinished in your life. Be honest with God about, hey, this feels incomplete. I felt like you told me this was going to happen and it hasn't happened, or I've been praying for this to happen and there's no movement here. Just name it and be honest about it. But the second thing is then surrender control over it. And what this looks like is praying every day, God, this is incomplete, but I'm trusting you with it instead of trying to control it myself. You know, control is a funny thing, and we talked about it a lot over the course of this series. What I have learned in my life is you can do everything right and things still go wrong. You could be the perfect parent. You could raise your kids perfectly, and they can grow up and make dumb decisions because they're human beings who have the capability to do that. You can be the perfect husband or wife, and your spouse could wake up one day and decide they don't want to be married anymore, and they can do that because they're human beings who can make their own choices. You can give your entire life working at a company, being the best employee they've ever had, and they can call you in the office and say, we're downsizing and your job's being eliminated, and they can do that because they're human beings who have that choice. I think for a lot of us, we spend our entire lives trying to control other people, trying to control circumstances and situations. And one of the most powerful things we can do is just name it and then say, God, I'm surrendering this to you. And then the third part of trusting is just take the next step God's asking you to do. Listen, I'm a planner. I like to think 7, 8, 9, 10 steps down the road. But what I'm learning is walking with God means just focusing on the next step. What is the right next thing? You may not have a picture of what your future looks like, but what you can do, you can put your resume together. What can you do? You can show up to a networking meeting. Your marriage may feel like it's falling apart, but what can you do? You can still date your spouse. You can choose to pray for them every day. See, we can take a small next step as part of our surrendering control. I have one more point that I want to make, but I want to make sure we leave time for Q&A. So just want to remind us of our guidelines. Questions, not comments, relatively quick and to the point and relevant to what we're talking about today. So if anybody has any questions and they want to raise their hand, Mr. Adam will bring the microphone around. Going once, going twice. All right, the last thing we can do to position ourselves in a season of waiting, not only do we remember, not only do we trust, but we also make sure we're ready to receive what God has for us. Here's what I mean. We talk about this psalm being a psalm of ascent. And so this is Palm Sunday, where we're reminded that there were Jewish people from all over the world heading back to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. Now, Passover is rooted in the story of Exodus. If you remember in Exodus, God's people had lived enslaved for over 400 years. Talk about people who really knew what a season of waiting was like, asking for God to show up and to move. God sends Moses to confront Pharaoh, and he does. He says, "Let my people go." Pharaoh refuses, so God sends a series of plagues on Egypt. The last one is that God says, "I'm going to allow the destroyer to come through and to take the life of the firstborn in every household. But there is a way to be safe. You can take a lamb, you can sacrifice it, put that lamb's blood on the doorpost of your house, cook the lamb, and have a meal together with your family. And if you do that, the destroyer will pass over." That's exactly what happens. Pharaoh wakes up in the morning and sees all the devastation across his empire. And he says, "Fine, you guys get out of here." And so they leave, but every year they have a meal to remember the night that the destroyer passed over those who were saved by the blood of the Lamb. And so as the Jewish people are returning back to Jerusalem, they're singing songs like Psalm 126. "God, you've restored us before, and we believe you will restore us again. We've been in a season of suffering, but we're ready for a season of joy. When we were enslaved in Egypt, you set us free. Now we are oppressed by Rome, and we're waiting for you to liberate us from our enemies." And so there's this tangible excitement and energy in the air, this feeling of revolution. And all of a sudden, Jesus, this rabbi that they've heard so much about, is headed into town riding a donkey. It's as if he's headed in ready to take on his enemy. And so you can see why people would place their expectations on Jesus. "Jesus, you're the one who will conquer our enemies. You're the one who will liberate us from oppression. You're the one who will free us from our exile." And by the way, all those things were true, just not in the way the Jewish people understood. See, he would conquer the enemy, but not the enemy of the Romans, the enemy of sin and death. He would bring them back from exile, but not an exile living in a foreign land, but an exile living separated from God. It was Jesus himself who said, "Unless a seed falls to the ground and dies, it cannot produce life." And when Jesus was nailed to the cross, it was his life that was given for ours. And then 3 days later, he rose again. And the authors of the New Testament look to that moment and say, Jesus is the first fruits, that for anyone who places their hope and trust and faith in him, that's our hope as well. Not just a hope for some future resurrection, but that new creation life begins here and now. And so for some of us today, the first step in seeing life come from dead places is simply to receive the gift of Jesus' own death and resurrection on behalf of us. There's nothing you can do to work to earn it. We just receive it. And for some of us in a moment, we're going to have our normal time of communion. We have our communion stations around the room. On one half, we have our communion elements, the crackers and juice, the body and blood of Jesus. On the other half, we have our prayer elements. You can write a prayer and put it in the prayer jar, or you can light a candle, because throughout church history, that's represented offering a prayer to him. But see, we started doing communion this way coming out of COVID, and so we want to do it in as germ-free way as possible. But you know, throughout church history, one of the primary ways that you take communion is you don't take it, you actually receive it. Somebody is there with the bread and the cup, and it's a reminder that we're not taking anything from Jesus today. We're just receiving him afresh and anew. And so maybe for some of us, that's what this moment needs to look like. As you're spending this time with Jesus, a couple questions to guide your conversation. The first one, When has God been faithful in the past? I know it's easy to look at our current circumstance, present surroundings, to feel like things are up in the air, things are uncertain. But maybe we need to remember his faithfulness in the past so we can be grounded in the hope we have for the future. The second question, how can I trust him this week? Is there an area in your life that you need to name is still incomplete? Is there something that you've been holding control over that you need to surrender, you need to let die, you need to let go of so that God can take control and bring life? Is there a next step that he's asking you to take? I don't know what it is for each and every person, but I know he's asking us all to take another step today. So all across this room, would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we just come before you right now, and we're thankful. We're thankful that we don't have to work or earn your love or salvation. And so right now, I just pray for those who maybe for the first time just want to receive you as their Savior and as their Lord. I pray for those of us who feel like we're in the middle of that waiting season, that valley of death, that you just help us to position ourselves properly so that when you're ready to work and to move, that we can receive all that you have for us, Jesus. And so I pray in this moment you would meet us here and you would continue to shape us and change us to be more like you. It's in your name I pray. Amen. As you feel led, our communion